A man who stepped only 50 yards away to fetch water and disappeared forever. That is how one can describe that incredible and eerie story that happened near the Nantahala River in North Carolina on June 18, 2013. At first, none of the tourists suspected that a calm summer evening, gentle sunshine, and the sound of splashing water would turn into one of the most mysterious disappearances, which is still talked about by the locals. Only a few steps separated 34-year-old Mark Evans from the campground and his friends, but those steps were the last anyone saw or heard of him. What happened on that clear evening when a man literally vanished into thin air in the middle of a friendly group of people just meters from his own tent? Why did a 12-day search involving the rescue services yield not a single result? And how to explain those strange clues that only confused the situation even more? On June 18, 2013 in northwestern North Carolina, the weather was clear. The sun was shining, the daytime temperature was plus 28 degrees C, and forecasters did not anticipate any significant changes. On this day, a group of 6 hikers stopped by the gentle bank of the Nantahala River. They knew each other with varying degrees of familiarity, but had decided to join together for a couple nights away from the city, with a campfire, guitar, swimming, and heart-to-heart talks. There were 6 people in that group. 34-year-old Mark Evans, always energetic and adventurous, who had already proven to be an excellent camping organizer. 31-year-old Natalie Johnson, a friend of Mark's since college. 39-year-old Greg Morris, who had hiked several times in neighboring states and worked with Mark. 28-year-old Anna Kowalski, an acquaintance of Natalie's and a newcomer to camping. 36-year-old David Carter, a longtime friend of Greg's who is a rock climbing enthusiast. And finally, 27-year-old Lucy Morgan, a yoga instructor and nature lover who had never been on an extended camping trip before. They arrived at the site in the afternoon when the sun was at its zenith and, having chosen a conveniently flat spot by the shore, began to set up for the night. By evening, the company had already prepared dinner and sat around the fire, discussing plans for the next day. The time of sunset had come, and the forest was gradually sinking into a cool twilight. There was a calm, even peaceful atmosphere all around. At about 1930, Mark, noticing that their water supply was almost exhausted, suggested that they go to the river to get a couple more jerry cans and not mess around this morning. The distance from camp to the water was no more than 50 meters, with a straight path visible between the trees. He picked up the canister, said something like, "Now I'll get fresh water for the morning," and set off to the river alone. No one thought to escort him. It was literally a couple minutes' walk. But it was this short journey that proved fatal. Normally, it took no more than 5 or 6 minutes to reach the shore and draw water. 10 minutes had passed and still no Mark. No one was particularly nervous, thinking that perhaps he had stopped by the water to admire the sunset or had gotten distracted. After another 5 minutes, however, Natalie and Greg decided to go after him, because it would be dark soon. When they reached the shore, all they saw was an empty canister lying on the gravel. There was no water in it, and Mark was nowhere to be seen. Shouting and calling his name was useless. There was no answer. The forest was silent. Greg, searching the shrubs along the shoreline, saw no obvious shoe prints in the wet sand. Natalie had claimed that the sand was soft enough to hold footprints well before. But there was hardly anything there, she recalled. It was as if Mark hadn't made it all the way to the shore at all. Returning to the others, Natalie and Greg reported that Mark was nowhere to be found. The others rushed out to look for him. Some went along the river, others deep into the woods. Everyone called out for Mark, but to no avail. The minutes passed, it grew darker, and the anxiety grew. By 20 o'clock, it was clear that he was not coming back. No one heard any screams, no noise of falling, no splash of water. At 21 o'clock, it was decided to act according to the plan. 2 guys went to the car to call the rescuers. The local search and rescue service in Swain County responded quickly. By midnight, the sheriff and his deputies and several volunteers were on the scene. They conducted a nighttime search of the coastal area, even as the weather began to deteriorate, with fog creeping in from the mountains and cooler temperatures in the woods. In the dark, the results were nil. No obvious clues, much less signs of a struggle or cries for help. On the morning of June 19th at dawn, Cynologists with dogs arrived, and divers arrived to survey the riverbed. The plan was clear. A part of the team would check every meter on the bank and in the nearest bushes, another would investigate the water, and the third would send out groups along forest trails with a radius of up to 5 kilometers. However, from the very beginning, the rescuers encountered an inexplicable difficulty. The dogs did not pick up a single clear trail. Where Mark should have passed, the smell broke off just a few meters from the camp. The next day, as the search expanded, a volunteer named Jaden Scott discovered another detail. It was a windbreaker lying on dry ground in a thicket about 1.5 kilometers downstream. Nearby lay a lone sock, also in near-perfect condition. The friends who identified the clothes claimed that Mark had worn a similar windbreaker the day he disappeared, though he hadn't really needed it in the morning because of the heat. The question was, why were these items so far away, and why in an area already checked previously? The day before, when the searchers had gone through there, the windbreaker and sock were gone. Those who preferred rational explanations suggested that Mark, if he was still alive and in a disoriented state, might have scattered his clothes himself. But then the question remained, why? And if someone else had done it, for what purpose? No traces of blood or signs of a struggle were found on the windbreaker, and the dogs did not pick up the trail again, as if the person who had left it had vanished. Police reports and volunteers' recollections repeatedly mentioned the fog, which was forecast to be light and short-lived, but turned out to be too thick and dense. Every morning, starting on June 19th, it rolled in streaks, blocking visibility for several meters. According to some searchers, it felt like it was easy to lose one's bearings in this fog. People were confused about directions, even though they were usually good with a map and compass. Of course, skeptics believe this is a common natural phenomenon of mountainous terrain, but most participants recalled that they had never seen fog that thickened so quickly and so densely. More curiously, telephone communication in the camp area was becoming unstable, although no signal problems had been reported before. Interference and noise in the radios made coordination of the search more difficult. Some volunteers ended up recircumnavigating areas that had already been surveyed to avoid missing any possible traces of the missing person. From the perspective of his surroundings and family, Mark did not appear to be a person prone to suicide or sudden flight. He had a stable job in the marketing department of a small firm, had plans for a wedding next year, and was looking forward to this summer vacation, according to friends. Some relatives recalled that Mark sometimes complained of insomnia or that he had recently become anxious, but he had no serious problems or reasons to disappear. When Mark's parents joined the search, they tried to explain to the police that their son had good stamina and would definitely not dare to leave without notice. In addition, all his personal belongings, phone, wallet, documents, were left in the tent. The family persuaded the rescuers to expand the search for dozens of kilometers, but alas, it did not yield any results. For almost 2 weeks, the area of the Nantahala River turned into the epicenter of search operations. Every day, rescuers went around the forest, divers checked the flow of the river, helicopters and drones with cameras and thermal imaging cameras took to the sky. However, no body, no living person, no new leads. The dogs lost the trail again and again near the camp, as if Mark had ceased to exist a few meters from the campfire. The friends who remained on the spot all this time went through many stages, from shock and panic to the agonizing realization that the chances of finding Mark alive were rapidly vanishing. They had to give interviews to journalists who picked up on the mystery disappearance sensation, but there was no breakthrough in the case. One after another, the theories of accident, wild animal attack, or attack by criminals fell away. Not a single trace of violence, blood, or struggle was recorded. Locals and individual enthusiasts began to refer to the case as the Missing 411 series. This unofficial term refers to cases in which people disappear in conditions seemingly minimal for misfortune, near a group of companions, in clear weather, in clear and not too difficult terrain. No trace is left behind, and later, sometimes the missing person's belongings turn up in strange places, in perfect condition with no apparent reason for being there. The story of Mark Evans quickly became one of those things they say. It's as if a person walked through an invisible door and left reality. Of course, no one officially claimed mystical or paranormal phenomena, but the cumulative details led people to the most fantastic speculations. After 14 days of continuous searching, the Swain County Sheriff issued a statement suspending the active phase. "We have tried every method available. No new evidence related to missing Mark Evans has been found." At the same time, the case was not closed, but search teams have curtailed their work. Mark's family and friends continued to urge volunteers to keep going for some time, but eventually it became clear to everyone that the situation had reached a dead end. Later that fall, in the same area, a local hunter reported smelling a strong odor of decomposition near the edge of the woods. He hoped it might be the body of a missing hiker and called the police. It ended up being the remains of a deer. No more human tracks were found at that spot. This happened several more times in the following months. All such signals turned out to be false. To reporters who continued to inquire, the sheriff replied that the case remains open, but without new evidence there was nothing to investigate. Over time, the story ceased to attract mass attention, replaced by other news stories. Friends of Mark from time to time gave interviews to specialized programs, telling about their version of events. But there was no consensus. Someone believed that he could fall into the water. Someone blamed unknown forces. Someone in despair talked about a mental breakdown. It is often said that in such disappearances, the worst thing is not the fact of disappearance, but the complete uncertainty, when there is neither a body nor any credible explanation. People are left with the agonizing question, what really happened? In the case of Mark Evans, that question hangs around the Nantahala River to this day, and the answer seems to have been swallowed up by the same evening fog that so suddenly covered the banks the day he disappeared. She dreamed of summiting and disappeared without a trace. That's how local newspapers later described the disappearance of 27-year-old Emily Harris, who on September 5, 2099, went on a solo hike up Mount Katahdin in Maine. No one could have predicted that the sunny skies and calm weather would turn into one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of this popular hiking trail. Emily was born and raised in northern Maine. According to relatives, she had a lifelong love of mountains and the outdoors. Having earned a vacation at her firm, the girl decided to spend it unconventionally, to make a solo trip to Katahdin, to take a break from the noisy city and test her own strength. Her family discouraged her from going solo, but Emily was confident. The route didn't seem too difficult, and the weather promised to be clear and warm. For the first couple of days, she sent regular short messages to her family. All is well, the summit is near, the view is fabulous. Especially happy was the last message, which came on the morning of September 5th, where Emily wrote that she was already on the summit and was about to start her descent. The family felt relieved because the main goal, the conquest of the mountain, her daughter has fulfilled. However, the connection was cut off. Attempts to call or get a message back were fruitless, and a day later the relatives became seriously worried and reported her missing to the emergency services. Rescuers immediately went to the area of Mount Katahdin. The first thing they did was to find Emily's tent. It was in the intermediate camp on a gentle slope, almost perfectly pitched and with no signs of disorder. Inside were almost all of her personal belongings, her papers, purse, some of her clothes, and even a notebook where Emily had made notes on the progress of her journey. It looked as if the mistress was about to return. There were no signs of struggle, blood, or scraps of clothing around. Everything looked quiet and untouched. At first, search teams assumed an accident. For example, Emily could have fallen off the slope while descending. Over the course of a week, rescuers and volunteers combed the main trails and dangerous areas known for rock piles. Service dogs were brought in, but they did not pick up any clear trail. Helicopters with rescuers on board flew over the mountain and valley several times, but found no body or brightly colored fragments of clothing. The weather remained good the whole time, which theoretically made the search easier. As the days went by, no clues emerged. Another question was why Emily had left most of her belongings in the tent if she had only planned a short climb and a quick descent. It seemed as if she had indeed returned from the summit, and for some reason had only had time to only partially change outfits, and then left in an unknown direction. However, the dogs did not pick up any fresh odors near the camp. The search continued for several weeks, and locals who knew the mountain well joined in, but each day brought only disappointment. No sign of Emily, no new leads. At the end of September, the official operation was over. Relatives were never able to find out what happened after her daughter sent a reassuring message from the summit. Today, years later, Mount Katahdin continues to attract tourists. But Emily Harris's story has become a grim reminder that even in perfect weather and on a relatively easy route, a person can disappear without a trace. Her open tent and neatly packed belongings are still remembered by local rescuers as a symbol of a mysterious disappearance that may remain unsolved. The section of the trail known as Dragon's Tooth has been attracting hikers for years. It's part of a larger trail through the Virginia mountains and is famous for the beauty that the local terrain is packed with. The name refers to the sharp and narrow rock ledges overhanging the chasms, like the protruding fangs of a monster frozen in eternal guard. That's where three buddies decided to go. 42-year-old Jonathan Clark, 38-year-old Paul Stanton, and 41-year-old Mike Green. All three were experienced travelers but not professionals. They already had several climbs under their belt together, such as the trail on Old Tosca in North Carolina, a walk in the mountains near Seattle, and easier routes in the Blue Ridge region. Jonathan was the most thoughtful of the trio. He was a keen landscape photographer, a collector of rare images, and a frequent blogger about the intricacies of hiking. That day, April 12th, 2015, was cool and slightly foggy in the morning, but with a promising forecast. The weather forecasters said that the clouds would clear by noon, and the hikers would have an almost cloudless day. Jonathan, Paul, and Mike had hiked part of the trail the day before, making a small bivouac near an easily accessible site. They had to contend with dampness during the night, but that didn't put them out of action. By dawn, everyone was in high spirits, and the most interesting part of the trail lay ahead, with views that locals said were breathtaking. Around 7 in the morning, they rolled up camp and set off. Jonathan walked ahead, stopping constantly to catch another shot on his DSLR. "You're going to fall behind again because of the pictures," Paul jokingly scolded, trying to keep up the pace. Mike, usually the most silent of the two, was following the route on the map and estimating how many hours it would take them to get around the entire planned segment. At Dragon's Tooth, they planned to linger to take a general picture with the protruding cliffs in the background. No one noticed anything sinister in the atmosphere of those hours. On the contrary, an elevated mood prevailed. The tops of the mountains were barely visible through the morning haze, and the forests around them were coming to life after the cold weather. Jonathan, as usual, became the chronicler of their journey, often asking his friends to pause to capture an interesting tree root or the falling light on a mossy rock. His camera was a trusted companion on such outings, and never failed. As they approached the Dragon's Tooth area, it was clear. The day was going to be clear, and the view was going to be amazing. Jonathan's plan was to catch the moment when the sun's rays hit the fangs of the rocks at a certain angle, creating dark shadows and bright highlights at the same time. By then, Paul and Mike were getting a little tired of stopping. Not that they didn't enjoy the photography, but they had hoped to go faster. At about 12:30, as the data on the camera they found later showed, the friends stopped for a quick snack. Jonathan apparently took some pictures from an unusual angle, showing part of their trail and the distant mountains in the haze. These photos were later scrutinized by the police, but nothing suspicious appeared in them. The men drank water, snacked on sandwiches, and moved on. Around 1 p.m., they reached a key point, a lookout point in close proximity to prominent rock ledges. Here the trail makes an arc as it passes along the cliff face. According to Paul, Jonathan was literally glowing with excitement. He said it was like this place was made for a photographer, a perfect composition. However, the friends realized that the route would be a little more challenging. They would have to climb a sharp rise and stay away from slippery ledges. It was nothing extreme. You just had to be careful. After another 20 minutes, the trail turned steeply at one point behind a cliff. Jonathan asked the two of them to go ahead while he took some more pictures, and then he would catch up with them in a few minutes. This had happened more than once on the trails, so no one saw it as a problem. Paul and Mike nodded and moved on. After 10 minutes, however, they noticed that Jonathan had not caught up with them. At first, they decided to wait. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. When they turned around, none of them saw him on the corner, and they did not hear any shouts. Paul suggested they go back. Maybe he got stuck on a slippery spot or dropped something. Mike agreed, and they set off back along the section they had traveled. But when they reached the place where they had last seen him, Jonathan was gone. But his camera was lying peacefully on the trail, a meter away from the cliff. It was the last point where they found anything belonging to the missing man. Jonathan himself had disappeared. It was like he vanished, Paul would later say. They checked the nearest bushes, peered over the rock ledge, called, shouted, all to no avail. Paul and Mike realized the joke was over. A quick check showed that there were no visible signs of a fall or snapped branches nearby, and there was no blood. However, the cliff around them looked extremely dangerous, and it was possible that Jonathan might have fallen off. Trying to find something, the friends cautiously looked around the edge of the cliff. There were clumps of rocks and bushes visible below, but nothing to indicate Jonathan's presence. As far as they could, they shouted into the void. But the answer was only the ricochet of their own echoes. Time passed and the day waned toward late afternoon. In the Virginia woods, spring sunset doesn't come too early, but the friends knew they had a limited amount of time to find the missing man. Finally, Paul picked up his cell phone, but there was no signal. Mike moved a little higher to where the trail widened and tried to get a connection there. Finding a weak connection, he called the emergency services, explaining the situation. The emergency services asked them to stay put, conserve their phone charge, and wait for the first responders to arrive. Mike and Paul tried not to go far away. What if Jonathan was somewhere nearby, just traumatized? But no matter how many times they called, no matter how many times they looked in different corners of the trail, there were no answers. A couple hours later, around 4 in the afternoon, 2 forest rangers who had been sent to make a preliminary assessment of the situation came to them. They reported that a larger team would be arriving by evening and began their own superficial inspection. The rescue operation had already begun on the night of April 13th. Experienced climbers, professional volunteers, and Forest Service workers pulled in. Duty teams with stretchers and medical equipment were brought from the nearest town. The idea was to check every crevice and every piece of rocky slope. Could Jonathan have fallen or gotten stuck without losing consciousness but unable to speak? Unfortunately, the night took its toll. A chilly wind blew, light rain fell, and the trails became slippery. We decided to postpone the search until dawn, limiting ourselves to a rope survey of a few nearby ledges. As a result, by the time the main team arrived in the morning, there were about 20 people ready to comb the area. Mike and Paul were shocked but braced themselves. They had to tell the authorities exactly how their friend had disappeared and help them navigate where they had last seen him. First of all, they checked the cliff itself. The 3 climbers went down, using every precaution. For half an hour they studied the slopes, shining flashlights into caves, looking under ledges. Nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a human body, not the slightest sign that anyone had fallen. The dogs, who had been brought in on purpose, took a sniff of Jonathan's belongings, something from a backpack found later near their camp, but couldn't identify a sure trail. The territory was combed in a radius of several kilometers. The forest, uphill trails, places where theoretically he could turn off. After all, if Jonathan had decided to leave the main route for some reason, why not go to the side trails? But all to no avail. The volunteers did not hear any screams, nor did they find any broken branches, traces of a fire, or any human markings. Meanwhile, police seized a camera left on the trail. It was a Canon DSLR that Jonathan liked to take on hikes. Inside was a memory card that contained a number of pictures taken just half an hour before the disappearance. There were no signs of damage to the camera body, although the lens was slightly dusty. Paul said Jonathan usually wore it on a strap and was unlikely to have accidentally dropped it, especially so neatly, somewhere off to the side of the trail. Police have studied the latest images. A few shots showed Mike walking forward, a view of the landscape with Dragon's Tooth stretching off to somewhere further away. The last photo, judging by the date and time in the metadata, was taken at about 1308. It shows a fragment of rock and a patch of sky. The photo seems to have been taken at a strange angle, as if Jonathan had accidentally pressed a button. No mysterious figures, no silhouettes, no animals. No signs of struggle or panic were captured by the photo. It was like a random shot. This increased the mystical halo around the disappearance. If he was not carried away by the current, there is no river here, or kidnapped by an unknown intruder, no signs of struggle, no screams. If he had, for example, fainted or had a mental breakdown, why did he go nowhere? But the dogs checked the trail further along the route, and again, nothing. The police officially recorded disappearance under unknown circumstances in their report. Jonathan Clark was not an extreme or reckless man. He enjoyed hiking, but his friends described him more as a careful traveler. He was unmarried, living with a girl named Sarah Blake, who later told reporters that Jonathan was the calmest and most rational person she knew. He never complained of mental illness, nor did he talk about wanting to escape from life. On the contrary, he had plans: a trip to Hawaii, a desire to publish a photo album. There was also no suggestion that he could have arranged the disappearance on his own. Money accounts, phone. Nothing indicated activity after April 12th. No bank had received a request for withdrawals. His cell phone never connected to the networks. All of Jonathan's personal belongings, wallet, car, which were left in the parking lot at the foot of the trail, remained intact. The police ruled out the criminal version between the friends because Paul and Mike were in tears, begging everyone to find Jonathan, and were extremely depressed about what had happened. Local residents interviewed by reporters said that Dragon's Tooth sometimes gives unpleasant surprises. Someone gets lost in the fog, someone goes off the wrong path, falls and gets injured. But it was the first time that a person disappeared in a couple of minutes in a viewable area, leaving his camera behind. Meanwhile, the story of Jonathan's disappearance has shaken up the neighborhood. Volunteers and rescuers launched a major campaign using quadcopters and a helicopter to survey the surrounding neighborhood from high above. For the next 3 days, Dragon's Tooth was buzzing with activity like it may have never been there before. It seemed impossible not to find a missing person within a radius of a few kilometers with such resources. But all the efforts were fruitless. The thermal imaging cameras showed nothing, and the noises and shouts that had been used to call Jonathan were drowned in the echoes of the forest. Moreover, it seemed strange that there was no sign of alarm, even in the place where the camera had been found. The ground was rocky. No footprints could be discerned there, but neither were there any scratches characteristic of a human fall or struggle. About a week after the disappearance, they called in the cinematologists with dogs from a neighboring county, perhaps more experienced or trained for such cases. They again did not pick up a distinct odor, although they reacted to the personal belongings of the missing person at the start. The odor was lost within a few meters of where the camera lay. It was as if the person disappeared without a single sound. As the head of the search operation said, "Usually, when someone disappears in the mountains, we find at least the slightest clues: prints, scraps of cloth, freshly broken branches. Nothing here. It's a rare case where we can only wonder where the missing person has gone." After about 3 weeks, the full-scale search began to wind down. The official police statement included the wording, "A person is missing under unclear circumstances. Further operations are inconclusive." What really happened to Mark Evans on the banks of the Nantahala River? Where did Emily Harris disappear to on Mount Katahdin? And why did Jonathan Clark never return from the Dragon's Tooth Trail? These questions remain unanswered to this day. Perhaps humans sometimes get too close to the mysteries that nature carefully hides from us. If you have your own versions of these mysterious disappearances, be sure to post them in the comments. Don't forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel not to miss new incredible stories. Take care and see you in the next episodes.